Good afternoon, good morning, everyone joining us. We're very excited to have you here in our webinar about orphaned well plugging credits. My name is Alexis Wilkman, and I am a senior associate at RMI's Climate Intelligence Program. So today's webinar is intended to provide both an introduction to orphaned well carbon credits, as well as a candid discussion of what it will mean to scale this credit type responsibly. So I'm going to start us off with a short presentation. It will be about 10 minutes, and this will cover everything that you in the audience should know about orphaned wells, including the current state of the credit market and some of the key challenges and opportunities for this credit type. And after that, we will transition to a really fantastic panel discussion with three experts from across the market. We have Chris of One Shot Earth, whose registry Open Carbon Protocol has issued credits under the newest orphan well methodology. We also have Dwayne, who is an experienced petroleum engineer with deep knowledge of orphaned wells and orphaned well decommissioning. And we have Tristan of MSCI, who has reviewed and rated numerous orphaned well projects under multiple VCM methodologies. And at the very end of the session, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So throughout the webinar, please submit your questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I'm going to get us started. So first, what are orphaned wells and why are they an issue that we're talking about today? Well, we have a very long history, about 150 years, of drilling oil and gas wells here in the US and Canada, and subsequently there are millions of these wells. And when a well reaches the end of its productive life, its operator is legally required to plug the well, which is essentially permanently sealing up that well so that no fluids or gases can escape from the wellbore. When we're talking about orphaned wells, we're referring to a very specific subset of wells. So these are wells that are not producing oil or gas. They have not been plugged or they have not been properly plugged. And they no longer have a solvent operator that is responsible for plugging the well. So a well could become orphaned if its operator goes bankrupt. There are also many legacy orphans out there that were left behind before we ever had any regulations that required well plugging. But regardless of how a well becomes orphaned, these are wells that have fallen through the regulatory cracks and are now a burden on our government and on taxpayers like you and I. So you may be wondering, why do we have to plug these wells? Why can't we just leave them as they are? The reality here is that they pose a real threat to both humans and the environment. Because they're not plugged or not properly plugged, they are often actively leaking or can leak toxic brine or other hazardous compounds into the air or the soil or the water. And the key concern from a climate perspective is that many orphan wells leak methane, which is a powerful and short-lived climate pollutant. So we really want to plug these wells. It's necessary to plug these wells to neutralize all of these threats. In terms of the scale of the problem, we know of at least 120,000 orphan wells in the United States alone, but it is safe to say that this is a complete underestimation of the problem. There are many more, hundreds of thousands more, unknown and undocumented orphan wells out there. And I've alluded to the fact that it is ultimately the responsibility of the state or provincial government in the US or Canada, respectively, to make sure that these orphans get plugged. But unfortunately, regulators are quite limited in what they are able to do quickly. They are reliant primarily on bonds that operators must post to cover the cost of plugging. But when we look across the board, we've seen that these bonding requirements are inadequate or out of date. So they are not always fully covering the cost of plugging. And governments also have very limited capacity. They have backlogs of orphaned wells that could take them many years or many decades, or in rare cases, it could be hundreds of years to plug all of the orphans that they need to plug if they continue moving at the pace that we're moving today. So when you combine all of these factors, we've got the large scale of the orphaned well problem. We have very limited public funding and public capacity, and real impacts on both the climate and communities. This is what has created the case for using carbon credits to accelerate well plugging efforts. So today on the voluntary carbon market, project developers can earn credits for taking over these orphaned wells and plugging them. So essentially, they earn credits for the amount of methane emissions that they are avoiding, and methane emissions that would have otherwise occurred should the well be left as it is, unplugged. So the very first methodology for plugging orphaned wells was the ACR methodology, which was released in 2023. And we also have three additional methodologies that have become available since then. We have one from B Carbon, one from Carbon Path, and the most recent is the Open Carbon Protocol, or OCP methodology, which was released last September, to give you an idea of how recent these methodologies are. So today, these latter three methodologies remain active while the ACR methodology is inactive for a revision. But if you look at all four of these methodologies, they have generated about 8 million credits to date. Just under 1 million have been retired, and this is across 80 projects in the US and Canada. So for those of you that are VCM wonks, you're aware that this is actually a very minuscule number. And we can think of this credit type as one that is niche and in the really early stages of market development, and it is obviously actively evolving with new methodologies arising. So while this is a very small category, these projects are also aligned with a trend that perhaps many of you have noticed, and it is in the title of this webinar. They address a super pollutant, methane. So these are often perceived, projects like these are often perceived as one way to turn off the proverbial tap on climate change and have an immediate and high impact on mitigating climate. So I think we can view this as a potential opportunity for growth for this project type. And finally, in terms of how the market has reacted to these projects, I would say it has been largely positive but mixed. If we look across specific project ratings, we can see ratings from double B to double A. And of course, there has been this churning among the methodologies, with the ACR methodology being revised and new methodologies arising. And all of this has happened in just a matter of about 3 years. So I believe that orphaned well projects are at an interesting and important moment in their evolution. They have challenges that stakeholders are actively working through and debating, and many factors that also make them a really valuable climate and environmental intervention. Starting with some of the challenges that the market is working through. So first, orphaned well projects face a practical challenge, which is that there is significant variability when you compare one well to another in factors like depth or age or geology. There is also significant variability in the methane emissions from orphaned wells. And I'm not just talking about comparing one well to another, but also variability over time at a single well. And all of these variabilities make the cost of plugging a well rather unpredictable. They can make project economics challenging and also makes emissions quantification difficult, which means, there isn't really always a one size fits all approach for this project type. On this note of quantification, the available methodologies do diverge here, particularly in the way that they evaluate the baseline emissions scenario. So, in really simple terms, we have some methodologies that focus on measuring current emissions from an orphaned well, while others are focused on estimating the future or a potential leak using a modeled approach. And this ultimately translates to different credit volumes depending on the methodology that you use, which has raised some questions about comparability and perhaps confidence. Finally, there is still a lot that we don't know with certainty about the long-term outcomes for plugging projects, specifically when it comes to permanence. So how long will these plugs hold up? And things like potential leakage, where methane could migrate through the subsurface and leak out of the ground through alternate pathways. But alongside these challenges and areas where I think best practice is still evolving, there are really meaningful opportunities for this credit type. So first, I've driven this point home a couple times, but these projects are targeting methane, which is one of the most important short-lived climate pollutants out there. And reducing methane emissions has a really outsized impact on the climate relative to the other climate mitigation opportunities that are out there on the voluntary market. Secondly, these projects provide important co-benefits for communities and the environment, which I think are frankly undervalued on the voluntary carbon market. Plugging projects protect water resources. They can address public safety concerns like airborne toxins, and ultimately they help to remediate liabilities that communities have, in some cases, been fighting many years to have addressed. Third, this project type has generally a strong case for additionality, with many wells destined to remain waiting for plugging if we don't inject additional financing. And finally, these projects play a critical role in producing some much needed data on where orphan wells are, how much methane they're emitting, and how they behave over time. And today, our understanding of orphan wells is somewhat incomplete. So this data is critical for us to understand how to prioritize future remediation efforts and regulation. So I'm at the end of this presentation portion. A quick plug. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about some of what I've discussed, I encourage you to go and read RMI's explainer on this credit type. And I will say that this is largely RMI's perspective, and I am very excited to hear what our panelists have to say about this project type. So I will transition us over now to the panel discussion, where we can further tease out some of these challenges and opportunities. So hopefully my panelists are now visible. And I will start by reading out our introductions. So first we have Chris Fort. Chris is the COO of One Shot Earth, the climate technology company behind the Open Carbon Protocol, where he's helped build the operational and market infrastructure for high integrity carbon credits since joining as the company's first employee in 2022. He leads strategic partnerships across ratings agencies, insurance providers, academic institutions, and NGOs. And before One Shot, Chris worked for 15 years in capital markets, including as a partner at a proprietary trading firm. Between his time as a trader and joining One Shot, he spent a year as a Sloan Fellow at MIT, studying the intersections of sustainability, business, and capital markets. Thank you for joining, Chris.
Thanks for having
Next,
me.
we have Dwayne Purvis. Dwayne has been a reservoir engineer, entrepreneur, and executive in the oil industry for over 30 years, having led or participated in hundreds of engineering studies over dozens of basins in the United States and abroad. Originally trained as a petroleum engineer, Dwayne recently earned a master's degree in sustainable energy from Johns Hopkins University, and his current consulting work focuses on the decarbonization, decommissioning, and transformation of the oil industry. Thanks for joining, Dwayne. Finally, we have Tristan Loeffler. Tristan is head of carbon projects at MSCI Carbon Markets. He joined Trove Research in 2022 to build its carbon credit ratings product. Since becoming part of MSCI in 2023, Tristan leads the carbon projects team, including its carbon projects ratings, which have rated over 4,500 projects across the carbon markets. Thanks for joining us, Tristan. So, a warm welcome to our panelists today, and thank you for joining this discussion. As a reminder to folks in the audience, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to leave a question for our panelists, and we're going to have some time at the end of our session to answer these questions. So I'd like to start with some questions for our panelists that kind of ground us and give us a better idea of where the credits are now and how different sections of the market are thinking about some of the challenges that this credit type faces. So I will start with Chris. The OCP, or Open Carbon Protocol methodology, is, as I mentioned, the latest orphaned well methodology on the voluntary market. And I imagine that the team at One Shot and your collaborators have learned perhaps from some of the early debates and challenges and experience that emerged from project developers as they implemented some of these earlier methodologies. So I'm curious to hear if you could tell us a little bit about what One Shot saw as the opportunity or contribution to the orphan well space when thinking about this new methodology with your collaborators.
Great. Yes. Thanks, Alexis. And thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here today. So, we at the OCP exist to build trust in climate claims by being the platform that documents climate actions through transparency and consensus building. We have the ethos that a ton avoided today is more important than a ton tomorrow. Methane is a clear expression of that principle. As you already covered, it's short-lived super pollutant. So action is it has outsized near-term climate impact. So what happened with the OCP and Orphaned Well is a proposal came to us to develop a new methodology, and we're excited to support it for its super pollutant aspect. But where we saw the opportunity is that we learned that science was developing new ideas around it, and that earlier projects were showing that there's needed to be some updates, and it needed pretty much a new methodology. And as we can see, sometimes traditional registries that can take a really long time. Our methodology review process is designed to move faster than traditional registries. Our process is iterative and multi-stakeholder. So there was a proposed methodology and it underwent multiple rounds of review and revision, incorporating perspectives from across the industry. And what's approved and issued today reflects that consensus building work. To focus more on what were the core design changes. So there is, more new science and ideas around improved measurements and procedures in the potential to emit model, and also an additional permanence check. So it includes a credit holdbacks for 12 to 18 months until there is a check on the quality of the plug. This incentivizes the operators to either buy insurance or they do have to go out and revalidate that the plug is holding after that time period. And a lot of plugs, if there's problems, they show up very early. So that increases our confidence in the permanence. And the methodology itself states the case for using potential to emit, which you can read in full on ocp.earth, and you can even see the processes of making the methodology. And I don't speak for the expert panel that approved it, but properly incentivizing actions by project developers who find wells that are outside the current regulatory action list, but with an outsized risk of negative climate impacts over the crediting period makes sense to me. So that's those are the two main things of really tightening up that science there and adding in the bigger checks. But yeah, happy to talk more about what we've seen.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Next, I have a question for Tristan. So, Tristan, you've spent a bit of time evaluating individual projects in this space. And of course, I mentioned some of the many different factors that can influence the quality of an individual project. We've touched on things like additionality and permanence and the quantification. I'm curious that when you are evaluating an orphaned well project in particular, what are the main dimensions that influence the quality of a particular project?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Alexis. So as you mentioned at MSCI, we've rated over 4,500 projects now, and that's really across a very broad range of project types. And each of those will be assessed against a sort of common set of six criteria. So criteria like additionality or quantification or permanence on the emissions impact side. Then there's also aspects of implementation integrity we look at, such as co-benefits. Um, But for something like orphaned oil and gas well projects, which is where we essentially will take those criteria and then we'll have a very specific methodology for how we rate projects of that type. I think we found the variability and risk mostly sits on the emissions impact side of um, that sort of spectrum. And I think there's probably three factors in our work we've probably seen the most variability and potential for risk. Think the first of those on the additionality. I think this is a project type where, because the concept of financial additionality is rarely the big constraint. There's rarely like a reason that financially you would be plugging many of these wells without carbon credits. So I think the additionality from a financial perspective is very strong. The question probably on the additionality side is more of a legal one, or whether the well would have been plugged, whether that's in the short term, medium term, or long term, by sort of a state agency um, or any other kind of authority. I think secondly, on the quantification side, really a key challenge here is what you're doing is you're sort of at a very basic level, you're estimating what emissions would have happened over a 20 plus year period based on obviously measurements you have to take before the well itself is plugged. And so that has two sort of sub problems. Obviously, you need to make sure that initial estimate you're making is generally representative. And then you also, secondly, have to make sure that you're then modeling in an appropriate way how those emissions would have evolved over time if that well hadn't been plugged itself. And then thirdly, on the permanent side, I think a lot of the time the plugging can be it's obviously a very physical and durable intervention. But you could, in theory, have problems in terms of the successfulness of that plugging, and therefore, again, having the right monitoring in place to confirm that that plugging holds is obviously a key thing. So those are sort of the main dimensions, at least we've seen the most variability.
Thank you, Tristan. Appreciate that. I'll end this first round with a question for Dwayne. So, a theme that comes up often in discussions of orphan well credits is their variability and their complexity, including, as I mentioned, the differences between individual wells and basins, fluctuations in emissions over time, differences in production history and age, and wellbore and wellhead integrity. So, you are a technical guy. Could you please tell us what are the top three things that non-technical stakeholders should think about when understanding the practicalities and limitations of plugging orphaned wells?
Well, then thank you for including me in the discussion, Alexis. And it's a good question. But reservoir engineering and petroleum engineering is a little like equine dentistry. It's a specialty and then a specialty within a specialty. But we deal with over or almost 2 million unplugged wells in the United States alone, across about 36, 37 states, and about as many basins. And what we see is every possible variation. And there are no wells that do not produce natural gas. I have heard a theoretical argument of one well in the Permian Basin, but all of those 2 million wells have the uh, risk of leaking methane to the atmosphere. What people need to understand then is that they need an analysis of the particulars of a particular project. The oil and gas industry has been developing its science for a long time, and on the whole, it's a very well developed, mature science. But we haven't been studying the issues, the questions, the technical questions at issue here in depth, as evidenced by the fact that the last major round of reforms to regulatory requirements for plugging was the 1960s, and the American Petroleum Institute published its first guidance on quality plugging procedures in 2021. So if we're not at the point, people need to understand that we're not at the point where this is commoditized and well understood and a consensus is built. Instead, as they're evaluating credits, they need to understand it on a piece by project basis, and they need to maintain some flexibility and some patience as the whole ecosystem of developers and reviewers and credit protocols and buyers iterate and evolve to a consensus.
Now, thank you, Dwayne. That was really great context for all of us here that are not deep in the weeds of the oil and gas industry. So next, I would like to dive a little bit deeper with our panelists on how buyers are thinking about these credits, how we and maybe buyers should think about baselines, and what we've learned from the first few years of implementation of these projects. So I'll start with Tristan now. Um, I've spoken to some buyers of this project type and buyers of many other project types on the VCM, and I've found that buyers are often trying to place orphaned well credits within a broader landscape of methane mitigation or industrial and energy sector credits. They're comparing across credit types on things like uncertainty and long-term performance and delivery timeline, etc. So if I am a buyer that is trying to compare orphaned well projects to other methane-focused projects, from your perspective, what is the argument for these credits over another credit type? And maybe what are some of the biggest reasons to be cautious?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, at a very simplistic level, at least the buyers we work with, probably care about sort of two main things when they're buying carbon credits. There's clearly the aspect of reputational risk that they want to avoid. And then secondly, that more qualitative piece about being able to tell a more credible story to their stakeholders about their carbon credit purchases. Um, I think at least for this sector, I think that reputational risk is probably like the dominant factor that most buyers are thinking about when they're considering these types of credits, and also probably other more methane oriented categories too. And so I think the real question is for a buyer, does adding these types of credits improve the portfolio's overall risk and also the cost profile as well? Um, I think the argument sort of for these types of projects and for these types of credits is, I think when some of the risks that we've been describing are properly mitigated, I think we've seen that these projects can rate very highly on integrity. Um, and I think secondly, even after controlling for integrity, one thing we find is that these credits also trade at relatively attractive prices for buyers. And so I think that mix of the fact that they can be very high integrity, also the sort of cost economics of these can also be attractive to buyers is a very good combination. I think the sort of opposite side of that, to sort of similar to what Dwayne mentioned, is not every well is going to be the same and not every project is going to be the same. And therefore, it does require quite a lot of individual project analysis, at least at the moment, to get that confidence in the integrity part, especially.
Awesome. Thank you, Tristan. So if we were to really like boil it down, what would you say buyers are actually looking for?
Yeah, I think it definitely sort of varies. I mean, there are very like sophisticated buyers in this sector that have very technical teams that understand these projects to a very high degree. You definitely also get other buyers who are sort of curious about this type of sector, but for them it is a new sector where that education piece is very important to them. Um, I think historically, at least when we sort of started really trying to focus on this sector about a year or so ago, um, I think some of the methodology uncertainty you mentioned was sort of very key on top of buyers' minds. Um, I think obviously that the fact that there wasn't a methodology that ACR had, it was made inactive, obviously creates a lot of questions in buyers' mind. And so I think particularly on that quantification side, that's where a lot of the focus of buyers is, making sure they have confidence in that. And fundamentally, it's not going to later come out that these projects aren't delivering the emissions impact that they're claiming to.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tristan. Next, I'll move over to Dwayne. So there has been a lot of discussion about the different ways that methodologies approach baseline setting. So I mentioned in general, we have methodologies either asking project developers to approximate the current leak that is happening at an orphaned well or approximate a well's future potential to emit. So from your perspective, what are the core limitations and strengths of each of these approaches?
Yeah, the fact that we're having a conversation means there's not a clear winner between those two choices. But we do have to establish this the avoided pollution. And that's the core question of the credit. The current emissions are good and valuable and effective in that they're concrete and they're right now. I can look at a well and I know it's leaking. And I know that if I stop it, it's going to have immediate impact. Now, the difficulty arises in understanding whether that volume is going to increase in the future, hold flat, possibly decrease. Uncertainties in whether or not the measurement you've taken is a reliable starting point to extrapolate. And then you can extrapolate formulaically, which ends up fitting some cases well and not fitting other cases nearly as well. On the case of potential to admit, you can do a lot more science. You can be a lot more specific to the situation that that well is in. Uh, but on the other hand, it's abstract. It's subject to technical expertise and technical uncertainty. And you're also not certain when it would emit. At what point in life would the wellhead decay enough, or the wellbore decay enough that the natural gas would begin to get into the atmosphere? So it poses questions on immediacy of impact, and thus to some degree on additionality. If the well is not going to leak for the next 15 or 20 years, then maybe the plugging programs will get to it. So I don't see a clear winner between the two, Alexis. I do see some complementary benefits.
Do you believe that these approaches are competing, or are they just suited for different purposes or different well types?
Really, what I'd like to see is both of them combined. Um, the if I knew a well was leaking, then I would have real incentive to do it now. But a formulaic quantification is unlikely to generate a large degree of confidence. So the oil and gas industry has spent a long time trying to figure out how to estimate what will be produced intentionally, what will be produced economically. We have a set of tools. But the best the industry has come up with for estimating economic reserves is not a formula or a set of rules, but a set of principles. Give it to an experienced professional and let them evaluate the unique variations and variability of this situation under these principles. So, what I really like the to see the combination of the best of both.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Dwayne. Okay. Finally, let's end this round with Chris. So OCP has issued the first credits under the Orphaned Well methodology about 2 months ago, and you've recently announced the first batch of credit retirements for the Great Plains 1 Orphaned Well project. So now that credits have been issued and retired, what lessons or surprises have emerged as you saw this methodology moving from theory to practice?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, the first project was done by Tradewater, who has a lot of experience in this field, and they and their validator were able to do it pretty well, and that buyer was really engaged with the process. I think as we've started to expand out to new project developers, because this space has a lot of people who are interested in it, we've received some clarifying questions. And I like to explain to people who aren't carbon markets people that a methodology is a recipe. It's what you follow to make your climate claims. And so, if we have clarifying questions, some of them are very technical and they're easily explained, but often, we need to make sure that this is the clearest methodology and the easiest to follow, and simple decisions are made. That's very conservative. Uh, as these projects have gone out to the more wider carbon ecosystem, you start getting all these different feedbacks of, oh, what is going on with these actual credits and how does this work with traditional carbon finance? And I see carbon finance as the trick of matching an activity that's going to stop emissions with the cost of doing it and then the permanence it's going to keep. There are other methodologies that in different project types that issue for potential emissions in the future, and that's where this methodology first came from. But I'm also very aware of how can you iterate and get better. Our process is based, we have a yearly audit of every methodology, and we anticipate reopening methodologies of any type every year, 2 years, 3 years, as science improves. So I've met with tons of people with really interesting ideas for how you monitor permanence over a longer period of time, how you insure against any potential issues in the future, um, and really layering all these things together and moving towards and building a process that everyone can trust is really what this process is all about. And, as Dwayne said, like there's so much knowledge in the oil and gas space about how you extract oil and gas from here. But it's every time I talk to somebody, I learn something new, and I spend a lot of time now these days talking with people about this. And so, we're always listening and iterating and moving forward. But the important thing is that we can get these wells that have this big risk, but aren't going to get plugged because they're not currently the highest leakers that would get on a list from a state regulator. That we get these plugged, it's a growing problem. And so, I think it's that moving forward together that's important.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've mentioned a couple items where maybe methodologies could evolve and maybe some thoughts here about strategy for moving forward together, maybe incorporating some of the expertise of the oil and gas industry. If you were to choose, maybe where do you feel the greatest opportunities are to refine the methodology going forward, and or what maybe a strategy that you think that we should be applying as we think about the next iteration of these methodologies?
Really, this is all about building trust. That's what carbon credits are. It's a trust that this process is needed and is necessary and is impactful. And so, I am always happy to figure out like how does this fit in best with how buyers are going to use them. If we need to, yeah, add longer permanence checks, that might, that could be something. But at the same time, we want to make sure that that's feasible. You go back and forth with people saying, how can you get access to land? If there's more, like my hope is better science on understanding what these wells will do. I talk to people and they say you need to look at this for months, for years. I'm like, well, now you're just venting methane. Let's close these things. But the better idea that we know what we're actually avoiding, and we have conservative assumptions these days, we think, but the more exact the science, the better. So continually just step by step forward, as I think the most important part for this market.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Okay, I have one more question for all of our panelists. What I'd like to hear from all of your unique perspectives is how going forward we can get these credits right. Essentially, what would need to become true for orphaned well credits to successfully and responsibly scale? And maybe here I could start with Dwayne if you're ready to go.
Sure, sure, sure. I'm an engineer, and my bias is always towards data. It may not be the most important issue for the whole ecosystem, the whole chain of interactions, but I do see a really significant need to improve the science of estimating how and when wells fail, when they lose integrity, and how the leaks occur. I think that would be really helpful to improve the trust factor.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Oh,
Maybe, yeah,
can I add one
please.
thing to that, Alexis?
Yeah, please.
Would also like to point out though, when you say scale, I don't think you mean that this is going to plug all 2 million wells. A successful scaling of this method of plugging wells is still probably a small minority of what needs to happen overall in total. There are going to be, I think there's always going to be a large number of wells, a majority of wells that aren't going to be suitable for one reason or another.
That's a great point, Dwayne. Okay. Maybe Chris, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, thank you. So I think responsible scale in this market, and Dwayne, I think that's a really good point about what we address and how we think of growing it. It's a virtuous cycle and not a hockey stick. We don't go from 0 to 2 to 100. Um, but that every party plays a role in keeping the cycle turning. And so, we're trying to build a solid foundation with methodologies grounded in the best available science. Um, and then, with early buyers engaging, adding confidence, from there, it's, new data, just like we've been talking about, more studies. How does this work if there's different geologies and jurisdictions? This is what our yearly audit cycle is built for. We refine the standard. We move on to the next cohort of projects so it's stronger than the last. And then as methodologies tighten and the evidence base grows, buyer confidence deepens and the demand base broadens, and then we, unlock the next wave. And so, but this only works if everyone is genuinely on the same team, and I hope we all are in trying to reduce emissions. But methodology developers have to be honest about uncertainty and willing to iterate. Project developers need to commit to rigor. Buyers have to ask questions and reward quality with growing commitment. And regulators and registries need to coordinate. And, I appreciate the work that researchers like this RMI team are doing of pushing science and educating the market. That's all this needs to do is step by step.
Well put, Chris. All right, Tristan, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to unfortunately have to reiterate some things that other panelists have said. But I mean, obviously, we need to, I guess, make some improvements on both the demand and supply side. I think on the supply side, we've talked about guess some of the issues in terms of historically unconvergent methodologies and thinking in this space, which I think if there is more alignment, at least within the sector, I think that really helps the market and helps bring new buyers into this space too. I do think, guess additionally, longer term sort of endorsements from other integrity labels would also help, whether that's sort of CCP eligibility, CORSIA recognition. I think some of those more external signals can do a lot of work, at least of bringing big segments of buyers into this area who probably otherwise may not be aware or be considering it.
Awesome. Thank you, Tristan. And thanks to all of our panelists for a great discussion. We're now going to transition into our audience Q&A portion. So as a reminder, if you have not already, please leave your questions under the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We've got quite a few questions that have come in already. I'm going to filter through these very quickly. A question for Tristan. Essentially, can you speak broadly to the fact that MSCI ratings may differ from the ratings of other ratings agencies? What are maybe you considering that others maybe aren't considering?
Yeah, I think without going into any specifics on individual projects, I mean, across the sort of rating agencies, we do tend to have alignment in terms of the exact sort of types of criteria we're looking at least at a high level. So those concepts of additionality, quantification, and permanence are obviously going to be common. I think what can sometimes change between rating providers, and I mean, at a high level, we do generally see good correlations between carbon credit rating agencies. But the things that can change is obviously sort of how much emphasis we put on different sub-criteria within those overall criteria. And secondly, also what the inputs are that we're dealing with. And I think this is an area where at least we found that historically, like what's publicly available may be sort of a subset of what's the full information space is. And I think those types of issues can lead to differences in opinions on projects, differences in ratings. Um, but as I said, at a high level, we do generally find some good correlations between the different agencies.
Thank you, Tristan. All right, next I have a question for the entire panel, so please, whoever feels compelled, go ahead and answer. Can the panel comment on any available technologies today to monitor for leaks for the lifetime of the credit?
So
Dwayne, do you want to take that or should I?
go right ahead.
Well, I'll start. I would love to hear your opinion on this, but I have people who have these different technologies reaching out to talk about how they could be included in future versions or how project developers could use them now. And so there are a lot of different ideas where you can put the sensors. The main idea is that you want to make sure that there's not methane still coming up because something's cracked underground. So I've seen things that can easily do 5 years. I've seen some things that are 10. I've seen some people who think they can do 20 years. It all depends on how much access do you need to the land. You can always do a person actually come over and just, so for on our methodology, a well must be leaking in its current state before it can even be touched to look at whether you can get a credit from it. Um, but so sometimes these are Internet of Things, sometimes these are satellite monitoring. There's a lot of interesting ideas. I haven't seen something that's deployed yet. The OCP is built to add layers of trust on top of our methodologies, so we are always willing to help a project developer go above and beyond, and then help show rating agencies what we're doing. But yeah, it's a growing field. There's a lot of really interesting ideas there, but I'm
There
curious to hear
are,
what
I
you think
agree,
there.
Chris. There are a lot of interesting technologies, but they're all new. Right?
Yeah.
It's not particularly sophisticated. It's not a difficult problem, except for the duration, but we haven't done it before. I think that we'll get there. But there are also people talking about using the same kind of technologies for continuous monitoring of wells not yet plugged. My friend Dr. Nima Daneshvarnashad has proposed that we might set up monitoring stations as part of the carbon credits and then plug them when they do start to leak. There are some creative ideas still to be found here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. All right, I have another question for potentially the entire panel here, and this one is about additionality. For companies considering these credits, how do you address the moral hazard risk that a market for orphaned well credits could create unintended incentives around end-of-life well management or weaken incentives for operators to plug wells? And what safeguards give buyers confidence that the projects are truly additional rather than obligations that otherwise would have been addressed?
So let me swing at that one. And this is an issue. Already, the system as it exists has a very significant moral hazard built into it. There are two different kinds of credits that both involve plugging wells. We're talking about plugging orphan wells, for which there is no available operator, no viable operator. If you start talking about plugging marginal wells, then it's something different. If you're plugging marginal producing wells, then you're paying oil companies. If you're plugging orphan wells, you're plugging wells that are already owned and under the responsibility of the state. So that what you're benefiting is the taxpayers of the state, and you're benefiting the people in the oil industry, but not the oil companies. One of the biggest opportunities for a just transition of oil field workers is the fact that we have hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of work to do in the oil field to decommission our heretofore assets. So I think the moral hazard is much more about marginal wells than it is about orphan wells. But that moral hazard certainly should be addressed. I mean, the biggest part of, and if a company is concerned, if a buyer's concerned that people are going to view them as advocating or supporting the oil industry, I tell them that they can also support reforms to decommissioning laws so that there are fewer wells, fewer orphan wells.
Very well put, Dwayne. Thank you. And I think you've essentially answered this, but this is a quick question. Is there a method that covers abandoned wells that aren't currently noticeably leaking from the wellhead? Um,
Yeah, the short answer is yes. You can have a well that earns credits for its potential to emit that is not currently emitting.
I would, yeah, one caveat here is that most methodologies require that the well is already leaking. And I would also say, what is your definition of abandoned? Because again, we're talking specifically here about orphaned wells. So just maybe to drive home at the point that Dwayne has made here that we're talking about a very specific subset of wells that have no solvent operator, but there are many other abandoned wells out there.
And when you say abandoned, you mean derelict, neglected.
Right,
And those can have a responsible operator or not.
right, exactly. Okay. All right, we have another question here. I think that could be answered by anyone on the panel, but we have a couple of people maybe called out. So we've discussed whether modeling emissions through measurement or modeling potential to emit is best, but I'd be interested to discover what's most conservative, which from my understanding is typically some form of terminal decline modeling, using the Payne Institute's paper. I know OCP uses this model decline, but I would be intrigued to hear the reservoir engineering perspective and the ratings perspective on this issue.
Uh, the most common method of evaluating what's going to be produced in the future for an oil company is decline curve analysis, which is to project previous trends. And there are several ways that that methodology, that tool in our kit, can be distorted and give an estimate that's mostly too high. One of those methods is by using too small an annual decline rate. The There are standards in informal standards in professional practice of reservoir engineering about how low that decline rate can be. But there are not formal standards. It ends up being a matter of professional judgment. And there are places where a 5% decline rate is okay, and other places where a 5% decline rate would be very conservative, very aggressive, rather, really optimistic. So I do strongly support the idea of a limit, some sort of constraint, but that constraint needs to involve some degree of professional judgment.
Yeah, and I think from a ratings side, I'd probably add again, it's very much sort of dependent on the individual project. I mean, the Payne Institute study that you mentioned is one of sort of the many inputs we use when we're sort of assessing the I guess appropriateness of the decline rates that have been applied. I do think this is an area where, while we think that study is very good, there is clearly room for more academic studies evolving science in the future. And it's an area where, whether it's us as a rating agency, I guess Chris, from a registry and methodology standpoint, we'll all have to sort of adapt and make sure as that science evolves, we're evolving too. Because I think some of these studies, while on the face of it, they can be very credible, we still need more science and more studies to sort of prove that on an ongoing basis.
Awesome. Thank you both. This is a question for Tristan. So Chris has mentioned insurance a few times. From your perspective, Tristan, would having insurance that covers the cost of replugging the well in the future over a 10-year time frame be a significant factor in how you rate a project, if you're able to speak to that?
Yeah, so it's definitely a factor that we look at in terms of whether there's the sort of the presence of that insurance. And I think from sort of a definitely like a cost standpoint, obviously like having that insurance means that it's obviously far likelier that any sort of future leaks would then be resealed and replugged. Um, I think again, it goes back to that sort of individual project nuance of exactly how the insurance works. Insurance by itself might not actually identify those leaks happening. So you sort of need multiple strands here. You need a policy and procedure in place to monitor and identify um, the sort of any kind of leaks that shouldn't happen that do. But then obviously the insurance on the other side of that can be very helpful to actually ensure that once those things have been identified, they can be appropriately resolved.
Thank you, Tristan. All right, so again, this is for the entire panel. We've received quite a few questions about additionality, so I'm going to try to ask a broad question here, but I'm hoping you can speak to the constraints that regulators are facing today and the requirements that project developers must meet to ensure that the well that they're plugging was not otherwise going to be plugged immediately or within the project timeframe.
I'll hop in with just like the very specific. So as part of our methodology, you have to get a letter from the relevant state agency that says this is not on our action list and is not something that is of notice for us. You know, they're they are overwhelmed in most cases and happy to have this done. And yeah, so I think that's like the most important part is that we're finding the wells that they're not going to get to.
Yeah. There are more orphan wells today than there uh, unplugged than have been plugged in the 40 or 45 years that these programs have existed. And they're growing rapidly. In Texas, it's at an all-time high, despite the fact we've been supplemented with federal funds. And they've asked for state funds from the general budget. Uh, I, until we have a very large change in the regulatory system, there's going to continue to be opportunities to plug wells that the state can't take care of yet.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left in this session. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us. I have one last question for you all. What makes you most optimistic about the role of credits to plug orphaned oil and gas wells?
I'm happy starting. I guess I would probably say if you probably looked at it a couple of years ago, I think a webinar on orphaned wells wouldn't have happened. And I think the fact that it is sort of showing that the education that is happening in the space and that will just generally lead to more awareness. Um, and I think if you look at stuff like the Super Pollutant Action Initiative, which was launched recently, again, it sort of shows that that awareness is starting to lead to action as well.
Yeah, I'm very
Yeah,
happy to. Oh, go ahead, Dwayne.
I just want to say me too. The awareness leading to action that Tristan identified.
I'm very happy with how many people have been engaging with this. I'm very happy that RMI is part of this. I'm very happy that, the Carbon Containment Lab is looking at this through the Beyond Alliance. It looks like that just that, and then you see the business case that you see people who are like, as you were saying, Dwayne, like there's a lot of people who are like, this is a good way to use skills to clean up all these negative externalities. And there's a lot of, I think, there's a lot of questions to be answered, but there's a lot of people who really want to answer the questions and build something um, that everyone can use and can really impact all of our lives. So,
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and another thanks to our panelists, Chris, Tristan, and Dwayne.